The NEP looms large, still, over Canadian politics, 40-some years later. So that's why I assigned this piece. It's the Chandler Moule, I'm missing someone. Cairns, he's the first author too, I think. So there's a lot in it. It's a pretty dense piece, so let's kind of walk through stuff first. What was going on? What's the backdrop in the 1970s that preceded the NEP?
Oil shocks, and to a lesser extent, environmental movement, but mainly the oil price shocks in the Middle East.
Okay. So one in the 1973, when the price of oil went up, I think that was the first time OPEC really flexed its muscles and restricted global oil supplies. And there were, in the US, long lines. There was lines outside gas stations of people filling their tanks. I don't recall there ever being lines outside gas stations in Canada. Like, I would have been not old enough to drive, but riding around in cars. And I don't remember that being a thing, but there was certainly a big price shock. Rise of the environmental movement. There was a second price shock in 1979, 1980. Price had gone down, it shot up again. Iranian Revolution in that case. What else was going on? Quebec elected a sovereigntist government in 1976. Parti Québécois government. And that put in motion efforts to reform Canada's constitution. And in particular, Pierre Trudeau, Justin's dad, prime minister at the time, his response to the threat of Quebec separation was to create a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And he had published scholarly work about this in like the 1950s, I think. He was quite opposed to, I think he used the term Quebec tribalism, but basically instead of seeing ourselves as members of regional groups, the solution that he proposed was to grant individual rights that were shared all across Canada, including, and his government had already introduced bilingualism in federal institutions and rights to bilingual education. And then Trudeau's goal was to introduce a Bill of Rights in Canada, but to reform Canada's constitution. And this gets back to Kelly's question. There was no, Canada didn't control its own constitution at that point. So there would need to be some level of agreement, it was expected, between the federal government and the provinces to go to the UK and say, we would like you to change our constitution. And in particular, we would like you to give the constitution to us to control from now on. And that meant the provinces were in play. The question of what else would be done to the constitution was in play. How the amending formula going forward was in play. So there was a whole constitutional thing going on at the same time as these two oil price shocks. And honestly, I don't think anybody was talking about the oil industry in environmental terms back then. I don't remember it. Yeah. I was like, a little high school environmentalist, and this was not the thing that we were concerned about. The climate change was not really on regular folks' agenda at that point. Okay. Price of oil going up globally. Who wins and who loses within Canada when that happens? What's the distribution of winners and losers? Yeah, Tim.
Western oil producing provinces are the winners, and eastern provinces with industries that need to consume that oil would be the losers.
So provincial governments, the government's winners because they collect royalties.
Right.
So western provinces, again, they own the oil and they get a share of the money. They could potentially adjust their royalties when the price goes up. The eastern provinces, not so much about the royalties there, it's about their residents, or everybody was gonna pay more at the pump.
Yep.
For oil. In theory, I suppose Alberta could have maybe reduced prices within Alberta, but at least there was the promise that they would have more money that could compensate for that through a heritage fund that was created through investments in schools and so on, whereas the eastern provinces, their residents, they're not citizens of provinces, their residents were gonna be exposed. There's no question they were gonna be exposed, and their provincial governments wouldn't have a windfall benefit. What about the companies?
They're pretty happy.
These are global markets. When the global price goes up, it goes up in Canada, and oil producers make more money. And we have seen this in with the price increases that took place in 2022. Companies were making record profits. At that point, the oil producers were disproportionately foreign owned. So there was a concern that those profits were gonna benefit shareholders outside Canada. So there were, beneficiaries beyond Canada's borders that were a concern as well. How did this impact the federal government? Anyone catch that? Equalization? How would equalization, I'm gonna.
So overall, it would kind of expand the federal revenues, which would then would go also towards redistributing profits from the western provinces of Alberta and Canada towards provinces that are losing out on money, like Prince Edward Island or Labrador. So it's part of the Equalization Act of ensuring that there is a bit more money where provinces need more money, but then that goes back to western provinces having a tenser relationship because they feel like they're paying for the benefit of other provinces.
So yes and no. Yes, in that equalization became more contentious. How equalization works, this is one of those ones where there's a lot of misinformation out there. And the perception is that the federal government collects money from provincial governments and redirects it to other provincial governments. That is not what happens. The basic rule, the basic principle of equalization is that it's a recognition that some provincial governments have access to more money than others because of, resource revenues, but also because people are wealthier and the economy is doing better in those provinces. And a concern that all Canadians should have access to some basic level of services from their provincial governments. So there is an equalization formula which averages the revenues per person that provincial governments have. And then the federal government's role is to bring the ones below that bar up to the bar. Everything isn't equalized, there's still some that are above the bar. They bring the low income provinces up to an average. And in doing so, they don't do that by taking money from provincial governments because they have no ability to do that. They take money from taxpayers across Canada. Lots of debates about how those revenues, where that comes from. So if you've got some provinces that are wealthier, there are more wealthier taxpayers in those provinces. So if the economy is doing really well in certain places, there are probably more of the high income taxpayers who are, paying more towards federal revenues. But it is also the case that the provinces that have most of the people are contributing most of the money to federal taxes. So in fact, one of the things, when I read these things, I notice different things every year when I read these things. And one of them was a comment that Ontario taxpayers were actually the main losers in this period. So nobody's taking money from provinces. The federal government wasn't making more money because it wasn't collecting royalties, but it had this responsibility to take its income tax revenues and use them, and corporate tax revenues too, I suppose. They might have had more money from that. And use them to bring lower income provinces up. And in fact, the gap between high income provinces and low income provinces got so big with the oil provinces being so much above everyone else that they changed the equalization formula so that oil revenues, I think, count a bit in there, but don't fully count in the equalization formula because they couldn't afford it. There's kind of like Alberta up there and everyone else, and if all of Alberta's revenues counted, they were moving the bar up and creating such a huge gap that the federal government was like. So the federal government arguably was a loser in this one too, because they were the ones responsible for doing that equalization with their tax revenues. What did the federal government do in response? What was the NEP? Let's focus on that one. There was a 1973 authorization of an export tax, but I don't know if they ever even did it. So let's talk NEP. Yeah, Tim?
Yeah, so the eastern provinces were paying their oil by global prices, and so they paid global prices to the western provinces, and basically what the NEP did was that they would pay a reduced price compared to global prices.
Say that again.
Market prices, global market prices. Yeah. Right?
I zoned out just for a second, I'm really sorry. So what we do have, we've got a situation where Canada is importing oil from other countries. I did not look up what the case was in 1979. I did look up some numbers last year. We import about 500,000 barrels per day, mostly to New Brunswick is where the ships land, but a bunch to Montreal. Couldn't figure out the exact details. There is most of Canada's production, 80% goes to the US. We produce about 4 million barrels of oil per day these days. So whatever, 3.2 million will be going to the US. Some of that, Alberta uses its own oil, no surprise there. They export some to British Columbia, and then there are pipelines going to Sarnia, the Enbridge, I think that's the Enbridge main line, a lot of refineries in Sarnia, and some to Montreal from a separate pipeline. And I'm thinking some of that oil that is going to eastern provinces has got to be making its way to Sarnia as well. I'm just not sure about that. Okay, so we've got this situation. Eastern provinces importing at global prices, western provinces producing. Tell us again, Tim, what the federal government did.
So essentially the East would pay lower prices for oil since they were no longer paying the global market price. The federal government, put a cap on that.
They fixed the price.
They fixed the price, yeah.
They regulated the price at the pump. I think they did that Canada-wide. I don't think it was just the eastern provinces.
Okay.
But yes, that was the core thing in the NEP. They also had already created Petro-Canada, People's Gas, a Canadian oil company which had both exploration and production facilities and gas stations all over the place, little Canadian, little maple leaf on them. And they asserted authority to restrict exports. but I don't believe that is used by the federal government. Why wasn't it used by the federal government? Catch, what did Alberta do? Alberta restricted exports itself. They had a staged reduction in production, which is very interesting in light of current developments. And this was not something they, this was not their first choice, gee, let's reduce our exports. It was part of the fight with the federal government, like, we'll show you, we'll reduce the exports. But there were, like, on the news, you could see images of oil rigs, exploration rigs, crossing the border, leaving Canada and going to the US. And, Albertans blaming the federal government for that, although, they had restricted production themselves as well in that period. What was the reaction to the NEP?
The western provinces, so mainly Alberta and Saskatchewan, used the NEP as like a federal overreach into their jurisdictional rights over their resources. And it kind of created like an alienation that, or was like, or worsened the alienation, I guess, between the western provinces and the rest of Canada.
They were really not happy, and this was the era of bumper stickers that said, "Let the eastern bastards freeze in the dark."
Yes.
In Alberta, like, this was not just the provincial governments, this was an on-the-ground fury. Provincial premiers asserted that it was unconstitutional, but it was, it was on the ground, and there was an emergence of, or re-emergence of Western alienation, this sense that the federal government is doing illegitimate things, they're taking our resources. Where was Ontario in this? Did you catch that in the reading, anyone? Justin?
I was only able to skim through this reading. I didn't get through all of it yet.
Anyone else? Yep,
I had a hard time penetrating this reading, but I read it all.
It's dense, that's why we're going step by step,
Yeah.
but I hear you.
Ontario was on board with the federal government. Eastern consuming province, so kind of along for the ride.
Yeah, it's the Ontario residents were the beneficiaries in this. Ontario was supportive, and in the constitutional negotiations that followed, Ontario opposed restricting federal authority. So we hear about sort of federal provincial conflict and pushback. It's not always all the provinces. Yeah,
I think this is around the same time. You mentioned some old cases as well. A lot of conflicts like being resolved by the Supreme Court, which essentially dictating that the federal government didn't have jurisdiction, I think. And they mentioned two cases. I'm trying to look through my notes.
Seagull, Canadian International Gas and Oil Limited, I think it was, and Canada Potash. So there were two big Supreme Court decisions in the 1970s that were complicated interpretations of what provincial governments can do and what the federal government can do with respect to taxation of natural resources. Canada's constitution says that the federal government has unlimited powers to tax, direct and indirect, and provincial governments only have authority to apply direct taxes. Economists that I talk to think this is just a meaningless distinction. And so there was lots written about these cases, but the, of course, Supreme Court justices, this is the words of the Constitution, they had to interpret them, and they did so in a way that said no to provincial governments. So those court decisions, which were pre-NEP, had also fed into this Western outrage, a perception that the federal government could take over our natural resources, and a concern for remedying that in this moment of constitutional reform. So thank you for raising that. What's section 92A?
That's like basically that's part of the Constitution, that's like natural resources are like provincial jurisdictions.
Yeah, so it was a new part that was added. 1867, the British North America Act, as it was known until 1982, had these two lists, section 91 and section 92. And section 91 is the things the federal government has authority for. Section 92 is the things the provincial government has authority for. There was already section 109, which said that lands, like crown resources and lands that have not been privatized, belong to the provinces. So the provinces already were controlled and got revenues from crown lands. But provincial governments were concerned, like this clearly was not clear enough, because they were outraged by these two Supreme Court decisions. So section 92A was added to the Constitution, and it affirmed that minerals, sites for hydroelectricity development, and forestry resources were provincial jurisdiction. Did it actually do anything new? Did you catch, there's a bunch of legal analysis in there that's pretty dense, tough going.
Did it expand the provincial powers over indirect taxation? Like it specifically related to natural resources? As you were saying, like the federal government could tax both directly and indirectly?
Yeah.
Whereas the provinces could only tax directly, so following section 92A, they have more available, or more options to indirect tax for the purpose of raising funds.
With what limitations? Did you catch?
I have the subsection 3, the authority of the parliament. Is that what you're looking for?
I don't know. Maybe, it might be. What have we got now?
Does the indirect resource taxation field by the British provinces must be shared with the federal government, which
So-
does have power over the tax.
It didn't limit the federal government's authority to tax the same revenue sources. Ontario had opposed, the federal government opposed that, so did Ontario. So it meant they both have authority to tax the same resources, which is always a tricky thing, because there's only so much money. They both have authority to do income taxes, but we only have so much money in our bank accounts or our pockets and they can fight about it, but it comes out of our money. So it made provincial governments less vulnerable to those kind of court, like it eliminated the risk of those court decisions happening, but it didn't make it easy, because they still have conflicting interest in trying to limit that. It also limited they could not use their powers in ways to discriminate within Canadian markets, or to assume the federal government's authority with respect to international trade. So there was kind of a recognition, yeah, you can do this, but by the way, this is their business. So that was probably even more important in limiting what this means in practice. My take on section 92A, and there were some little bits that I noticed when I read this paper again. I read it when I was working on my dissertation in like the early 90s, and I read it again a couple of years ago, and last year and this year. My take hasn't changed that much. There was this, clarity with respect to private natural resources, not just the crown ones. That could be, important, although honestly, the provinces probably already had that authority under their property and civil rights power. The indirect versus direct issue, but in practice, it was pretty proscribed based on international trade and interprovincial trade impacts, potential impacts. Mostly, it just restated powers that the provinces already had. They already own the resources. It had already been assumed all along that the owners have the authority to exploit those resources and collect money from them. I think section 109 was explicit about the money. They already had authority to regulate private activities within their borders under the property and civil rights power. So in practice, what's remarkable is this celebrated constitutional decision has not really mattered in any kind of constitutional decisions since then. Constitutional reform has not mattered, to my knowledge, in subsequent constitutional decisions, because honestly, it didn't change things in any significant way. Why was it important if it didn't actually, they fought hard over this thing. Provincial politicians today talk about section 92A. If it didn't do anything, how come? How did that impact?
I think because it created like a clear and established sort of ideas, and although there's still a little bit of like uncertainty about the exact like procedures, I think it still has like something that they're able to refer to, like you said, like 92A. It's something that you can refer to, and it's something that's easy to read and understand. So the provinces have a sort of quick like reference for when they want to reinstate their powers, so and just like remind the federal government of their powers.
It's something they can point to say, natural resources are ours. Kyle?
Yeah, I was just gonna add on like a kind of like a comment about like how like Canada's like federal system. I think one of the reasons was talking about it and how it was like originally intended to be much more centralized, coming out of like the American Revolution, which was like states' rights, well not states' rights, but that was the Southern Plank, and so Canada's going to be much more centralized, but it ended up being like, I think one of the reasons it's one of the most decentralized.
I think that was mine.
Yeah.
I think I said that.
It was one of the most decentralized.
I believe that, yes.
Yeah. But and like also how, I learned, like in one of my, in Poli 303 federalism, we learned about how like Canada, is like a quasi-federalist country in the sense that like most countries will, like the US for example, is like the federal government can do these things and then everything else is gonna left to the states in theory. But Canada has this weird, the state or the federal government can do this, provinces can do this, and there's a bit of like with natural resources, it's kind of like well not natural resources, but it's a bit of a foggy middle ground kind of overlap.
Although Canada's constitution leaves everything else to the feds informally. It's like, here's the federal list, here's the provincial list, and everything else is reserved the federal government under peace, order, and good government. In practice, court interpretations of what the meaning of those words were in the list, and especially a reluctance to turn to peace, order, and good government, and an expansive interpretation of property and civil rights within the province has resulted. That, plus ownership of those natural resources, plus Quebec, has resulted in a very decentralized federation. Katarina?
Yeah, so I was just going to talk about the courts, because it talks about earlier how the courts became a major site for dealing with, just lost it. With dealing with resource disputes. So by providing provinces with legislative authority, it gives them the jurisdiction when it or if they go to courts to be able to like have that in writing, like Abdo said, and something that they can actually refer to.
So Canada's one of the something you always have in a federal system is an explicit constitution. You have to have the lists. This is what you can do, this is what you can do. Otherwise, it's just like pretend federalism. If there isn't a constitutional guarantee that subnational governments have certain rights. And that's the difference between cities within provinces and provinces within Canada. provinces have constitutional jurisdiction. Cities only have authority to the extent the province gives it to them, and the province can take it back. That is not, the federal government can't do that with respect to the provinces. But the world has changed over time. What do these things mean? What do these words mean now that governments are involved in a lot of different activities? So as new kinds of policies emerge, as new kinds of problems emerge, federal and provincial governments go to the courts and challenge them. And we saw that with the carbon tax. So we saw it in the 1970s. We saw it with references to the Supreme Court, to initially provincial courts of appeal, and ultimately to the Supreme Court on the constitutionality of the federal carbon pricing legislation. So the court is the umpire in these battles. The thing about going to court is if you lose, you've lost. Your negotiating power is really reduced after you have been told you have the jurisdiction. So it's the high stakes thing. Somebody else had a hand up over there on this point. Was it you, Christine? No?
It was me, but.
No. We moved on. Alrighty. Okay, so that was this tumultuous period in Canadian federalism. There was also some tumult, I think that's a word, I should say, in the late 80s over natural resources between the federal government and the provinces. Somewhat different origin, but again, Supreme Court decisions, front page. I mean, I remember sitting in a coffee shop on 4th Avenue and thinking, oh my God, the Premier and Prime Minister are calling each other liars. It was like on the front page of the Globe and Mail, like this is so rude. It seems so mild nowadays compared to now. But the issue there was historically there had been a kind of agreement that the feds would leave environmental issues to the provinces. Every once in a while, environmental issues would be hot topic, and the federal government would propose you do a bunch of things, and most of the provincial governments would scream and say, this is our jurisdiction, stay out of it. Mostly they were screaming not because they wanted to be the ones to protect the resources, but because they wanted to be the ones to develop those resources, and they do not want the federal government telling them not to. That happened in 1970, the feds then backed off and left it to the provinces. And then there was another surge in public attention to the environment in the late 80s. And the federal government started, rattling its cage again and saying, we're gonna do things, we're gonna solve environmental problems. At the same time, the federal government had adopted a regulation about environmental impact assessment in 1984 called the ERP Guidelines Order, Environmental Assessment and Review Process Guidelines Order, but people actually called it ERP out loud. And it said if a project is using federal money or has any impact on federal jurisdiction, the federal government, the Minister of Environment shall undertake an environmental impact assessment. Now, it is very rare to see the word shall in Canadian environmental laws and in Canadian law generally. Very common to see it in the US because Congress passes laws that are implemented by the executive branch, and they want to make sure they tell them what to do. You must faithfully execute our will, and they put shall in there. In Canada, Cabinet, the executive branch, sits within and largely controls the House of Commons. And they like having discretion, so the laws that they pass usually include may rather than shall. But this regulation included shall, and they didn't really need it. They thought, well, it's up to us to decide anyway, and so the shall's not gonna matter. Apparently they were warned by a Justice Department lawyer. An environmental group went to court and said, Federal government has decided not to review this dam being built on the Rafferty-Alameda River system in Saskatchewan. But it says shall, and they have to. And a court said, yeah, it says shall, you have to. And so in that case, it was actually pushed on to the federal government by a combination of them getting a little carried away with their wording, and environmental groups going to court, and that became a big source of conflict because the federal government didn't really want to do all these environmental assessments. They hadn't been doing them all along, after all, but now they were stuck having to do it, and at a time when the public was looking for governments to take action on environmental issues. And so it's not a time to say, we didn't really mean it, we don't want to do it. So there was a dispute, two really high profile disputes, but this was a huge issue across Canada. There was a dispute between Saskatchewan and the federal government over the requirement for a federal environmental assessment of this dam, and it was a dam being built by the province of Saskatchewan. It wasn't just like a private activity, it was like the provincial government's own activity that the courts had said, called the bluff, and said you have to do it. There was another dam being built on the Old Man River Dam in Alberta. And this was a huge issue for provincial governments because environmental assessment, the federal government getting involved in environmental assessments, kind of pushed from behind by the courts and environmental groups, would give the federal government authority to say no to economic development projects within the provinces. And so it was, again, carried a big conflict. So we've got these two periods, the NEP phase, the Rafferty-Alameda Old Man Dam River phase. What insights does that give us for today?
I would say it kind of like sets a bit of the groundwork for the eventual carbon tax, I guess. Like how, like, it kind of sets a bit of precedent that the federal government can step in a bit with, I guess, environmental policies.
Interesting. Yes and no. There had been precedents before when the federal government stepped in, but what had happened every time is they backed off. So after those, disputes, the prime minister and the premier of Saskatchewan calling each other liars about a meeting that had taken place and suing each other. To a large degree, the federal government backed off. They introduced new legislation that said, we can do federal impact assessments under all these circumstances, or we can authorize the provincial government to do it for us. And that was very satisfying to most provincial governments. They had what was called a harmonization initiative, which basically meant, let's make decisions jointly. Let's constrain federal unilateralism. So, in the early 90s, I was conducting interviews with provincial intergovernmental affairs people, and I talked to a senior guy in the Alberta government. And this is only a slight paraphrase. I've quoted enough times that I'm pretty close on the wording, which is, if some guy moves into your basement of your house and you can't get rid of him, you at least try to keep him in the basement. And so what he was saying is the courts had allowed the federal government to move into the provincial house, and they couldn't really get rid of them. But what they did do is try to tie up their ability to do things unilaterally through this process of joint decision making. So yes, there had been a precedent, but in practice, the federal government had still conceded to consensus decision making before the carbon tax until 2018. What other implications were there from this pretty messy history? And this is like high politics. This was like, lead stories on the national news every night. as it is now. Christine, what do you think?
Could you repeat the statement again?
What are the implications of that history? Like, why am I having you read this stuff and talking about dams in the late 80s? What does that tell us about today? What are the implications of that for today?
I feel like I stated a little bit of something like this last week, but just kind of knowing the history, especially because we really were born so late, and just getting to know all the background of all these different like federalists and just the government structure really sets up that foundation just for anything, just for us to get to learn more. I feel like that's the same thing with a lot of other topics in poli sci, just to learn that foundation, and especially in this class to get into the deeper foundation for like things about environment really helps us talk more for later weeks.
Cool. So just knowing about what the institutions are, what, you know, how they work, what the limits are, is useful for you in understanding these debates now, because, you know, provincial premiers saying this is unconstitutional. Well, we'll see. But they've been saying it on lots of things, and they previously lost. But so have the feds sometimes. So, you know who's gonna decide if it's unconstitutional? Supreme Court. They're the only ones that can decide.
I think for me, like these videos are definitely giving me the context I need to understand why are we facing the political issues that we are today, especially when it comes to advancing any legislation or policies that can help us fight climate change and can help us fight the crisis right now. And really understand that Canada's political framework and the federal framework is so unique, and which leads to these like very unique issues and like conflicts between the provincial and the federal government. And I think as I'm reading through this, like I'm getting that context a bit more now, especially as someone who didn't grow up and that did not grow up learning about Canada's government. Like it's only since coming here to UBC that I've actually started learning more about it. So it's definitely giving me that context to see like why the issues today aren't just something that's happening today, it's been happening for decades.
Yeah, absolutely. And say Tim, then Amanda.
I think this has been quite useful in helping better understand Western alienation. Of course, Western alienation is not new, and NEP probably wasn't the cause of it. I think we can go back another century, but that's for another day. But
I only took us back as far as 1973, but
yeah,
it was a century before that.
yeah. And I think it explains like a lot of the sentiments that we still have in Western Canada today. Like especially with like election results, like the Liberals usually don't do very well in the prairies. Sometimes they do better in Manitoba, but even then I think they do a lot better out east. So there's just this kind of distrust between Western Canada and the federal government that of course goes back to NEP, because the West were losers, right? They made a lot less money with the price fixing and all that, and thinking that, you know, the federal government doesn't care about us and that they're always siding with the East and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, like Western alienation is not new, but for the debates that are going on right now, the 1970s still loom really large.
Yep.
Like, as someone
Yeah.
who studies environment, resources, energy policy, the number of times I've heard "son of NEP," like a federal a proposal is described in the Alberta newspapers, the Saskatchewan newspapers. When we talk about West, that's usually the provinces that we mean as "son of NEP."
Yeah.
It's been 50 years, well, 45 years at this point, but it still has enough currency that columnists use that phrase, or politicians do.
Yeah, this is pretty anecdotal, but like I have a few friends from Western Canada, and I'd say they're quite on the left, and I feel like some of them have told me that they would rather vote for Conservatives than for Liberals.
And why? Why?
Regional interest, like they just don't trust the Liberals to properly take care of Western Canada.
And there's kind of two things going on with the Canadian Federation, and they're reinforcing. One of them is that it's a big country, and so the economy of different regions is different. There's oil in some places, and there's rushing rivers in other places, and there's aluminum in some places, and you know, it's potash, whatever. But you layer a federal system of government on top of that, you have actors whose job is to defend those regional economies. It's not just that the federal government cares about them all, but there are actors, and there's a small number of them. So it's a very big deal that the provincial, territorial, and federal leaders can sit around a table. That doesn't happen in the US with 50 states and some territories. So there is a sense of meetings of equals, and those provinces are defending their own jurisdiction. And natural resources loom really large in those meetings. The other thing is simply the imbalance of the Canadian population. 60-some% of Canadians live in Ontario and Quebec. And, you know, Westerners are upset that they don't have representation, but there's not that many people up here. But it feeds into a sense of alienation, and especially if they're voting for different parties. So you can have like a government with a majority coming from Eastern Canada that has like no seats, because there's a smaller number of seats to fight for and a more conservative population. So Western alienation is not new, but the debates over natural resources in the 1970s and the late 1980s are still on people's minds when they are fighting about climate policy, when they're fighting about responses to potential tariffs from the US, and an oil and gas emissions cap, as we will see. Sam, did you ever do that?
I was kind of wondering, do Eastern provinces feel that, so the Western provinces kind of feel alienated compared to?
Except really, we say Western provinces, mostly we mean,
Alberta.
we don't mean BC.
Yeah, no.
We mean Alberta and Saskatchewan, and not even always Manitoba. So, we can still say Western provinces, but.
Yeah, but would the Eastern provinces then feel that the West, like Alberta, has maybe a disproportionate influence because of industry? So like while Alberta complains about, you know, like Quebec and Ontario, I think especially, I think there's maybe a sense from what I've heard anecdotally that there's, compared to the population, there's maybe a disproportionate influence.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think there will be people in my department who would know the answer to that question, but it's not me. Growing up in Ontario, like, you know, you're the big province.
Yeah.
You know, we're like, whatever, 35% of the population. Nobody ignores Ontario at election time. Nobody ignores Quebec. So, you know, it would be very disingenuous for Ontario people to say, but who cares about us? They're always worried about Alberta. But maybe there's some element of some perception there as well.
When you say, are you talking, because like, maybe that's just my bias because my parents are like from like New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, but when you said Eastern provinces, do you mean like the Atlantic provinces?
Ontario,
No,
Quebec, yeah.
Okay.
Laurentian.
Never mind. So I was
Yeah.
gonna say-
Because that's really different again.
Yeah,
Point.
and that's what I was initially thinking, because like, on the Atlantic provinces traditionally vote liberal mostly, and so I feel like they wouldn't feel ignored, and they got a carve out from the carbon tax last year.
Actually, the carve-out applies to oil wherever it's used, but it seems to have been driven by Atlantic concerns.
Right, yeah.
So it wasn't, the policy applied evenly across the country,
But
but had greater
But just
relevance.
disproportionate,
Yeah,
yeah.
there's more, well, actually a higher proportion of the beneficiaries are outside of Atlantic Canada, because there are people burning oil in Ontario, and there's all those people there. So more of the financial benefits went to Ontario. But as a proportion of the population, that oil part of, that was most relevant in the maritime provinces, for sure. History of the actual policy debates, I would say also just political culture. Control of natural resources and fighting federal efforts, you know, to control fees charged by railroads, access to getting wheat to markets, like this stuff goes way back. And identity of people who are from some of these provinces is very much tied to provincial control of natural resources. It's our oil. It's our gas. And I would think that's part of what's going on when your friends are like, I'm vote conservative.
Right.
It's like, you know, they're the ones who are trying to take our resources. Our resources is things one hears a lot about.
I think another thing that's important to recognize is that there's patterns that exist in these sort of political landscapes. So if we are able to kind of study the historical or even the ongoing issues, and you're kind of able to see like how do provinces react to federal federal overreach, let's say, or how do the people react to it. So I think it's important to know that, so that for future policies, or if we want to maybe think about how is this new idea going to be taken by the public, then I think we can look back at historical issues like this. And then another thing is, it also gives us a sense of the framework that we exist in as well. So studying, for example, the Constitution, like what does Section 92 mean? It's really important because it gives the idea of like, well, this environmental policy has to exist within a certain framework. It doesn't just, it's not just thrown out there. So we have to look at like the kind of like layout or the circle that we exist in.
The federal government won on the greenhouse gas pollution pricing references. They lost on the environmental impact assessment one last year before, I think early last year was when that one came down. So they don't always win on those ones, but that's the context within those battles, within which those battles are being fought out. The one thing I learned and then relearned, because I had forgotten it, from rereading this particular article, whatever, 30 years later, is that there is this perception that federal government policies have always been detrimental to the West. And when I was working in the oil patch in the late 70s as a student, there were the let the Eastern bastards freeze in the dark kind of period. I'm swearing in class because it's a quote. This was on bumper stickers all over the place. What was interesting, there's a in the oil patch, there were these old guys, the old guys who, they were like skinny old guys wearing cowboy hats, who'd been around, and this was, the late 70s, they remembered the 30s. And they had quite a different take. They remember the dirty 30s when the West was a dust bowl and had been much harder hit during that the great global recession coincided with a period of drought, and there was federal support for the West. And they were actually, kind of the old wrinkled dudes who'd been in the sun too much, had a quite different take back then. Now they're dead. But the other thing that I remembered, again, from reading this, is that there had been this period of decades of a policy that subsidized Western Canadian oil in Ontario and basically set the price higher that Ontario and Manitoba consumers were paying to encourage them to use Western Canadian oil. And there's a number in the paper that's like they were paying an extra 24 cents per barrel or something like that. It sounded kind of insignificant, so yesterday I looked it up. In 1960, when that policy was adopted, the price of a barrel of oil was like $2.80. So there was a period of decades where all those people in Ontario were paying an extra 10% at the pump in order to cross-subsidize the Alberta oil industry that nobody talks about. And it was actually much bigger in proportionate terms than the carbon tax. So, you know, some things get remembered and other things don't.
I think it kind of relates to what Ben was saying about like how things are portrayed in the media or just by the government in general, because oftentimes things, and it's not necessarily misinformation, but things kind of get played out a little bit differently, but there is misinformation at play as well. Even right now with like the carbon tax, you see lots of sort of incorrect or biased reports about it, and same with what you were saying, people, they might have just like not really communicated that that was happening, or they might have just not been seen as something that was important. So I think it's like the idea of communication as well that happens too.
Well, then, I think we are seeing more unconstrained communication. I think we're seeing politicians more willing to, this is not new, politicians have always made selective statements to make their party look good or their government look good. I think we are seeing a combination of social media, different actors in social media who are willing to say things that are just false, that has false, and then we've got, you know, a politician south of the border who says things that are false all the time. Like the same sentence can have multiple falsehoods in it. And that's kind of opened the door to, I think, politicians of all parties being a little more fast and loose. But it's not entirely new, but the scale. When I think back of, you know, the first Axe the Tax campaign by the NDP against the provincial, and BC NDP against provincial carbon tax, it seems so quaint now that, you know, there was some restraint in the kinds of statements politicians were making that I think is gone now. Okay, so who wants to summarize what you took away from my chapter? Touched on parts of it, but okay.
Well, I think part of what I took away is sort of having to do with people talking the talk, but not necessarily walking the walk when it comes down to it. There was one part where you talked about like people just not wanting to do as soon as it affects their economics, like particularly the Western provinces. So I think that was sort of one of my like main takeaways as to why that causes such a rift, is because like obviously we want to make these changes, but in order to make these changes, it also results in a massive economic loss for these provinces, and they're not really willing to make those concessions.
And it's real. There is a real difference in the economic implications of acting on climate change,
Yeah.
depending on the economy of different provinces. And this is kind of implicit in what Sam was saying as a topic for a paper, but if we fix climate change, those jobs will disappear. And so there is a real difference. It's not just about who gets the money, it's about whether that industry even exists. It's not anything remotely close to scale now. Yeah.
I just, so one thing to, over there, sorry.
Who's
Ben,
that?
sorry, Ben. That image as opposed to substance, that the provinces that have the lowest carbon burden are often the most keen to get on board. I mean, Quebec has a version of the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty right now. They don't extract any oil to start with, but that was so I don't know where it's at now. But just the example that those with the least to lose are the most willing to speak, and then speaks the problem that, okay, we're actually so far away from action. I don't remember if it was this reading or if it was another, but maybe you said that just the amount of time that was spent on meetings and deliberations for reductions that never took place. And just there's this very
That was probably last week's.
yeah, there's this very deflating, or it might have even been for the 351, but there's just deflating sense of, okay, we're throwing out, we're writing things down that will never be done, the goalposts are being moved. It feels right now, like it's actually all happening. Climate change is always in the future, it's the present, and you read about how the goalposts kept on moving, for not reasons that I like, but good reasons. There was other priorities, not right priorities, I would say, but just kind of a failure of the human, event horizon. The cost-benefit analysis is so narrow. Yeah.
There, I think this was a two-finger one.
It was just kind of building on what I'd said and also what Adam had said. It was a quote from your chapter which said, 2 provinces that account for 91% of Canada's oil production, Alberta and Saskatchewan, are the only provinces where less than half of voters accept that climate change is caused by human activity. And I think it just kind of really points like how they're sort of blinded by the economic prosperity of the oil and gas industry, and it kind of leads to like a bit of like denial.
It is, I wanna say I was shocked when I thought there would be differences, but the magnitude of the difference is really, huge. This does come, to turn it back again to what Adam was saying about, it's the provinces that are cleaner are the climate leaders, and the provinces that are dirtier are the dirtier in like greenhouse gas emissions per capita, let's say. Beautiful clean air, pretty gorgeous province, are the ones who are resisting. The clean provinces, Quebec, Ontario, British Columbia, is that hypocrisy? Is it just, bunch of hypocrites?
We all have different vulnerabilities and opportunities in our respective provinces, and I guess that's just why we're talking about climate federalism, is that we're differentiated. We're such a big, we're a continental country. So what's seen as a necessity for BC, and one that's quite advantageous and accessible, climate action for Albertans, even though like we just think of the like raving climate denier, but like rationally, it's a lot harder to get off of oil and gas, even if clear-eyed science is at the front of the conversation, which is not. But that's just how it works. We all have differing capabilities and hindrances.
Kind of following on that point, I always think it's kind of interesting how, of course, like I am fully like environmental sustainability, but if my livelihood, like if I was in Alberta, Saskatchewan, my livelihood, my family's livelihood depended on it. It's kind of sometimes like that immigrant thing where it's like people who come illegally, they come for a better life. It's kind of that same thing where you don't understand because you've never come from that point. So sometimes I always feel that like weird of like I don't really know how to feel because it's easier for me to be like you're doing bad things, but when it's what your life depends on and it helps Canada's economy run, it's like of course I can play the good guy. I think
I think there's a few ways to look at this. One of them is, this is just the reality. There is a huge incompatibility in the interests of these provinces. And so it's understandable that they take a different position. It's understandable that people are worried about what's gonna happen to their community. Like Fort McMurray would, if he actually fix climate change, Fort McMurray would go back to being a little farming town with a bit of oil production on the side. Like this is the scale of threat to these industries is existential. We have an existential challenge for humanity, and it presents an existential crisis for particular sectors and the current economies of particular provinces. So there's reality. On one hand, those who would pay that price tend to see it as hypocritical that Alberta or Ontario would say we need to do more. The other way to look at it is their provinces have citizens actually believe that climate change is real. They're responding to their voters who are not denying the reality of climate change. So is that hypocrisy, or is that actually better informed policy making? I mean, so I'm throwing that out there. Interestingly, Quebec has always been torn on this stuff. Quebec has the most, by various polls, the most environmentally concerned population, but is the strongest province, along with Alberta, in defending provincial jurisdiction. So in those carbon tax reference cases where Ontario on that one, Alberta, Saskatchewan challenged the constitutionality of the federal law, Quebec weighed in support of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario in challenging the federal law. They put provincial sovereignty ahead of climate.
I think it just goes back to your point of like each province has its own unique sort of actual political landscape and kind of what the people want. And then I think like the majority or like a big portion of Quebec is concerned with sovereignty and like a Quebec sort of cultural identity, which is why the government would also kind of put that forward as well. So I think it's just like recognizing the political landscape and the cultural tendencies of each province is important as well, because it's not just economic, but it's also.
Yeah. So to the extent these are real, these are like, we can't have our cake and eat it too. We don't get to have a thriving oil and gas industry and globally fix climate change. Is Canadian federalism up to the challenge? Is our constitution consistent? I'm gonna try to get some other folks in on this. Thank you, Adam.
I was gonna say.
Not because I don't appreciate it.
No, it's okay.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, like, on that question of like, Canada's federalism up to the challenge? Like earlier we were talking about like the origins of the Constitution and how like it was meant to be very very centralized at the beginning, and it ended up being very decentralized. And I guess like part of that way was like the framers of the Canadian Confederation kind of like put what they believed was like the most important into the hands of the federal government, and kind of like left education and healthcare, which in like 1880s or 1860s wasn't super top of priority. But like they also gave the natural
You were on your
resources.
own if you got sick.
What?
You were on your own if you got sick.
Yeah, exactly. There was no universal health care.
The church might help.
But they also left like the natural resources to the provinces, and like in the Constitution, like one of the quirks that I find really interesting is that the federal government like dictates like lighthouses for like the sea, because
I mentioned the lighthouses.
Yeah.
I-
You read
No,
the
like, in the
Constitution,
Constitution,
okay.
it says lighthouses.
And auxiliary institutions, which are insane asylums.
Yeah.
I looked it up.
But like I wonder like, and I think you did ask the question at the end of if Canada was a unitary state, would we have done strong climate action like decades ago? And I wonder like if like Canada wasn't a country but became a country today with the threat of climate change, or if the threat of climate change was a thing back in 1867, if like whoever was making the Constitution or whatever would have given natural resources or like significant environmental protections to the federal government to kind of have like one giant policy over 13 different jurisdictions.
Yeah, would we do it the same way? Implicit in asking that question is maybe we didn't do it right. Well, they did what they did
Yeah.
based on what they knew then, but maybe the decisions that were made then have not served us well for the current dilemmas that we face.
I think something else that's really important as well is I think like Canada sort of lags behind when it comes to things like environmental human rights. So I think that's another thing that we really need to discuss as well, like at a federal and provincial level, because there's so many countries now in the world who have this in their constitution, and who I think that makes it a lot easier to continue on the climate policy. But I think that's something that Canada, well, it is something that Canada doesn't recognize, and that we haven't really built into our constitution. So I think even amending the constitution, although it might be like almost impossible or difficult, is something that should be kind of added to this challenge as we go forward.
There are other things we might want to fix as well.
Yeah, definitely.
One
I'm
of
just
the,
saying
you
it's
know-
one of the challenges that we should kind of incorporate.
Justin?
Oh geez, hold on. Or can you come back to me in a second?
Yep. I would say that it's easy to, if you're looking at any political institution, including federalism, it's easy to, if something doesn't go well, it's easy to blame, to say, well, look, you can see how bad things played out in Canadian federalism. So one of the things I always say, it's not all about federalism. Canada has an extremely emissions intensive country, and it's not just Alberta and Saskatchewan where we're producing oil, it's that we drive the least fuel efficient vehicles in the world. We live in big homes, we commute long distances, we tend to drive rather than take transit. Like this, we have built a society on fossil fuels, and so that creates political challenges that are not just about federalism. But that said, I would argue and did argue in the readings that I signed today and the one last week that we layered on top a federal system that has made that even more difficult, because we've got provincial governments defending their economies and defending the fossil fuels that they own. And in the case of climate change, this isn't sort of, you can't like just sort of put a filter on the stack and solve this problem. It is caused by that product. And so this is a really fundamental one where the federal system has been quite unhelpful, and I'm going to come back to for sure. But there's the Constitution as written and interpreted. I'm looking, you're our Supreme Court person today, Kathy. There's how federal and provincial leaders interact with each other before they go to the Constitution, instead of going to the courts. And there, it is a really fundamental thing that we have assumed that we need to make decisions by consensus. We have given every province in that harmonization initiative, the way they kept the guy, the unwelcome intruder in the basement, is by saying, we will make decisions by consensus among all first ministers or all environment ministers in that case. And that has time and again limited federal action. Different provinces have exercised vetoes at different times, but that was not the Constitution. That was choice. And Trudeau passing that greenhouse gas pricing legislation was a huge departure. Like little notice, but that was like an earthquake in sort of how the federal government was interpreting its own constitutional authority. I'm going to go to Justin and
I think my point kind of carries off of what you were just mentioning, in that consensus is so important, but if anything, it's kind of proven that time and time again that it's actually so hard to get consensus. And having that kind of structure in the Canadian Constitution is kind of just shooting ourselves in the foot. And that's kind of without mentioning the whole time throughout all the meetings, one thing that's been kind of understated or just never really mentioned was also the role of Indigenous people in this, who have been completely just out of the picture in everything. And I think when you start to add their rising relevance over the past few decades, and especially now, and how they interact with climate change and just federal and national policy, it's just an extra challenge layer on top of consensus from provinces and stuff.
Thank you for that. We're not going to have any First Nations representatives at our First Ministers Conference next week. You know why? They wouldn't be invited. they are not invited. They are excluded. And that's intentional. Because, those actors lose control to the extent, more people are in the room, potentially exercising a veto. Abida and then Tim, you're gonna get the last word, and we're 2 minutes from the end of our talk.
So in your reading, you mentioned that, one, like a united sort of like national climate policy obviously works best. That's what we can reduce the emissions and stuff. But that's decentralized or sort of with a bottom approach, I guess, to climate policy. Often creates like a patchwork that doesn't really like exist together. But then within that sort of like dilemma, how do we recognize like the impact of communities, or just like the involvement of communities when it comes to climate action?
Local communities.
Yeah, like local communities, like for example, specific municipality or specific like, region. It's just how do we empower them also, so that it's not just this really big top-down approach.
Yeah, and we're gonna be hearing a lot more in the next 4 years about the role of states and communities in kind of staying the course in the absence of federal leadership. I'm thinking of the US in particular, but who knows what will happen in Canada. I think that's important because it's better than nothing.
Yeah.
But it's never the ideal because not everybody wants to follow the leaders. And that's true of provinces as well as governments. Was it you, Ben? Who was I looking to? Tim.
Yeah,
Tim.
mine's a
You get the
question.
very last word. Make
do-
it good.
Do you think that's a lot of pressure? I'm just wondering if you think federal unilateralism, of course it was what birthed the carbon tax, but do you think it was also what killed it? Since I feel like it kind of gave quite a bit of fuel for certain provincial politicians to rile up the residents of their provinces.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That one, I would say it's a bit like saying it's not all federalism. I think the main reasons is that partisan opponents, including within the federal government, the opposition, may pay with populist arguments that were often misleading or outright incorrect. The carbon taxes, consumer carbon taxes usually got popular, and getting rid of it will take money out of most families' pockets. This one is a big win for this evening. And I think federalism is like, part of the noise on that, but I don't think it's the main thing. And it's like kind of a gut. Thanks all. Looking forward to seeing you in your